How many fighters do we have? How many people are fighting Assad? How many? The number of fighters that are there, and I guess Aleppo and that region.
I can't put a number on Aleppo. The uppermost estimate of our moderate opposition fighter, the uppermost estimate I've heard is about 70,000 fighters. That's all the way from the south to the north.
Yeah.
But those are split into hundreds of different groups. So to bring coherence to that is very difficult.
Okay. And are there any of those anti-Assad fighters who are fighting ISIL at this point?
Well, yes. And before the Russian airstrike campaign, we felt pretty good about the word, I guess, is coherence and capacity that we were gaining along that Mara line, which is on the map, which I projected. But since then, a lot of those guys have peeled off from the ISIL fight to fight the regime, which has not been helpful to the ISIL campaign.
Well, let us just note that this administration has told us before that there will be no stability unless we get rid of so-and-so or so-and-so. And in fact, the opposite has been true. In Libya in particular, which you outlined today as being a catastrophe. We were told in almost the same words that you have used today, there's never going to be any peace there until we get rid of Gaddafi. And in fact, that's why we have to help the non-Gaddafi forces. And now we have testimony, of course, that ISIL is on the verge of taking over Libya. Let me note that I didn't see Assad as ever a threat. Was Assad ever a threat to the United States?
Well, Assad has given sustenance to Hezbollah and then terrorist groups for a number of years. He's a threat to some of our closest partners in the region.
They gave credence. Assad was never a threat to the United States. Frankly, we Republicans made a mistake when we backed our president when he said we have to get rid of Saddam Hussein. And frankly, it looks like to me that all of this chaos and confusion that you're describing today, that unfortunately is in your lap to try to correct, started when we made a mistake that we have to get rid of Saddam Hussein because he's a bad guy and he's committing atrocities against his own people. And that has destabilized the whole region and led to many thousands more people being killed. I would think, frankly, from a distance, it looks like Assad is in that same type of fighting Assad is the same type of situation. Let me ask, how many of the ISIL fighters are foreigners? Meaning from other areas rather than Syria and Iraq?
The total number of foreign fighters that have come into the theater are above 30,000, but many of them, as I mentioned in my opening, it's decreased quite a bit. So foreign fighters fighting with ISIL now, I'd probably put in the number of, according to our most recent estimates, of 15,000 or so or less.
15,000, and how many of those come from places like Chechnya?
Oh, a lot. And in fact, one example, when I was in Iraq recently with the Beiji campaign, there was a major battle for the Beiji refinery, a very heroic battle, went on for almost a year, and we were picking up mostly the fighters that our guys were dealing with.
So when
we're speaking Russian.
So we have all of these thousands of radical Islamic terrorist fighters and who come from Russia and Chechnya, and so the Russians maybe have something maybe even more important for them to be involved than us to be involved, because they have had exact fighters from their country. I don't believe there are any Americans over there with that terrorist group. Let me just say the idea that the Turkish, that we don't know where those trucks are going and who's purchasing that fuel is unacceptable. Let me just say that before the Russians started bombing those trucks, which then ignited this outrage from Turkey, that before they did, this committee saw evidence day after day after day of trucks loaded with fuel, thus meaning supplies and money and wealth that would go into ISIL, were just not touched. They were, how much evidence, Mr. Chairman, we had? Overwhelming evidence that this administration wasn't doing a thing about it. And once the Russians started, then we did. I think that this idea that...
Well, if I could just correct the record,
yes.
Since you raised the point, I think once the French started, it was the French, after the attack in Paris, attributable to ISIS forces, the French made the decision to hit those targets.
Correct.
On the open highway.
Let me also note that the Russians were doing that. However, you never know who the Russians are hitting because that's their business. They haven't been able to outline it for us. I would just say this, that people who are a threat to the United States of America, to our people, the terrorist network for around the world, we should be working closely with anyone like that who is not a threat to us. And whether or not they oppress their own people, I'm sorry. We didn't like Saddam Hussein, and look what we did to the world by getting rid of him. We didn't like Gaddafi. There's a number of cases like this. And the idea, our question shouldn't be, how do we get rid of Assad, and spending lots of attention and resources on that? Our vision should be, how do we get rid of ISIL and these radical Islamicists who will terrorize the Western world and murder us if they get a chance? Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.